Um, Hello, friends and colleagues, wherever you are, and welcome to another installment of our podcast. We hope this episode will excite you and invigorate you to ponder some of the perennial questions about religion, state, and human freedom. This episode has been a long time coming, and I am thrilled to be here today with my colleague from the School of Humanities, here at Western Sydney University, my colleague, Associate Professor Charles Barbour. Charles is an expert on Karl Marx, political theology, philosophy of technology, the 19th century intellectual history, and much more besides. He's currently co-director of academic programs at our school here at Western Sydney, and also a research member with the Institute for Culture and Society. Today we'll be talking about a controversial figure who preceded the more notoriously fascinating Karl Marx. This figure is by the name of Bruno Bauer. I certainly don't mean to belittle or demean Bauer as being any less significant than Karl Marx, but he's someone of significance in his own right, and I would say has his own place in the century of relevance, where he is hopefully going to be today. We'll shed a little bit light on his thinking and his approach and his relevance and importance today, by way of our guest, Charles Barbour. So before we get into your article, Charles, which is sort of the centerpiece of our conversation, I'm interested to know a little bit more about Marx, if you might care to maybe elaborate a little bit on Marx and perhaps talk a little bit about, I guess, in relevance to what we'll get to about Bauer, the philosophy of Marx in terms of his philosophical opinion on economy. His vision is really prophetic in many ways, depending on, I guess, how you see it, but I presume there's general consensus that he was quite prophetic in some ways about how he saw things to come pertaining to the state and economy. And so, if you don't mind, perhaps doing that, and maybe even talking a little bit about the young Hegelians in relation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sure. So I don't know. I mean, we could go pretty wide aperture. I think the place to begin is maybe with the story about the young Karl Marx. There's a general distinction in Marx scholarship between the young Marx and the mature Marx. And so the young Marx was sort of deeply philosophical. He, in fact, studied it to work in a philosophy program, planned to be a university professor. But he was sided with the group, the young Hegelians, who were initially favored by the state, but eventually became on the bad side of the state. The conservative forces in the state excluded them from positions of power. So he couldn't become a professor. So he became a journalist and discovers political economy. And from that discovery, he sort of develops his mature theory. So in his early work, he's very philosophical. In his later work, he's more interested in economics. Right. And that's a sort of very standard distinction in Marx's career. And he comes to have this picture of society as a kind of what we would call, like, crudely put, an economic base or a foundation of society, which is class determined, class struggle, modes of production, ways of producing wealth is at the foundation of society, and sort of everything else kind of is a superstructure sitting on top of this base. So religion, politics, literature, everything else what we call a culture, is sort of founded on this base. So that's kind of standard Marx 101.
Okay.
But the interest in the young Marx kind of really developed in the 20th century, because it was perceived that this younger Marx had a more kind of philosophical, more humanist sort of bent. And ultimately, this was a way of sort of challenging the Soviet interpretation of Marx. So you had this picture of young Marx as this alternative, more humane, more part of the longer intellectual tradition going back to the Greeks, more democratic, and more sort of Western. It was so-called Western Marxism. And so that's kind of picture that I initially appeared to me when I was studying, and I was always a communist, I was leftist, political activist, et cetera. But it was the picture that I first discovered when I came to Marx. But I challenged that picture in a lot of ways. And there's one key thing in this is that the key thing about the young Marx is there's an insistence that he's deeply influenced by Ludwig Feuerbach, who's
Okay.
another philosopher. And Feuerbach
Yes.
was the one who said religion is the alienated expression of the human essence. So God is humans project themselves onto this other thing called God, and we ascribe all of our best qualities to God,
Yes.
kind and good, etc. What we need to do is reclaim that and realize that theology is really anthropology. And we realize that it's really humans who are all these good things. And so the suggestion for a long, long time was this was the key figure for Marx. He becomes a materialist because he studied Feuerbach, and he adds the element of historicism to it. So he becomes a historical materialist. Don't worry about all of that. The key thing always said to be the key figure. I go back to the original manuscripts and say it's not true at all.
Right.
It's an invention of Engels in the later part of the 19th century to say that Marx was influenced by Feuerbach. The real key figure for Marx is Bruno Bauer,
Okay.
who was his teacher,
Right.
his university professor, his doctoral dissertation supervisor, and who was a cause célèbre in the 1840s. He came into conflict with the state and the church, eventually lost his job. This is the reason why Marx couldn't get a job in the university. And he was a radical, revolutionary Republican. But all of this was expressed through theological doctrine. So today we look back at it and think, why are you so obsessed with the details of the Bible or theology? And the reason was that's how you fought. That was the terrain on which you fought intellectual battles. And so he's a brilliant young theologian and completely prolific and deeply influential on Marx. Gives Marx his understanding of history, I would say, and largely forgotten because of this other story about the importance of Feuerbach.
Mhm.
Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, yeah, that's really fascinating. And I love the way that you sort of thought to question the assumptions and go back to the beginning. Um, and you're absolutely right. So when I was reading your article, I was struck by how much time you did spend on looking at Bauer's criticism of the Gospels, criticism of religious positions, and then with regard to that, and then through that with regard to the state. So in terms of yeah, is there any any more context that you want to add to this picture? I mean, what sort of part of the world are we talking about, Bruno Bauer?
Germany, Prussia,
Prussia,
in the 1830s, 1840s. He's a student of Hegel's, one of Hegel's last students. Hegel dies in 1831, I think. Don't quote me on that, but one of Hegel's last students. He wins the prize for his dissertation, so he's a star
right,
of the Prussian university system,
right,
which was the greatest university in the world at the time, was the University of Berlin. And Hegel was the most important professor in the world. So he was set up to become an important academic.
right.
Um, and I guess the one piece of context that's important is this idea of political theology. It's difficult for us to read these people today because they understand theology and politics as inextricably bound together.
Hmm.
What you say about God is what you say about the state. What you say about religion is what you say about culture. I mean, I guess you have to understand that every single person in Prussia goes to church. And if you want to have a real influence on the way people live their lives practically, the most powerful way to do that is by determining how they worship and what they believe. And so this is how you really do politics. You dig into the theological doctrines and try to figure out what they mean in terms of state formations and what they mean in terms of people's practical everyday lives. And so he's fighting these battles in political theological language, but that's the lingua franca of the time. Everybody knows that when you talk about religion, you're talking about the state. These things
Right.
are and it's not really even a code. They're just that's the language of battle. And I think that's the key. Another key piece of context is they're fighters. They're using that Marx and Engels criticized them for being politically ineffective, the young Hegelians. This is not true. They were using the tools of intellectual history and intellectual tools of intellectualism to fight struggles. And they were revolutionaries. They wanted to change the state. So this idea about political theology is key. Carl Schmitt picks it up in the 20th century and says, look at this weird thing. It used to be that everybody understood politics and theology were the same thing, but now we've forgotten this. Well, the 1840s are kind of the last moment when everybody understands.
Mm-hmm.
To talk about theology is to talk about politics, is to talk about theology, is to talk about politics. And so they're the last native speaking, I always say they're the last native speaking political theologians, the young Hegelians.
Right.
and Bauer is included. So that's some more context, I guess.
Yeah. In terms of, if I may just, sorry to interrupt. Um, I was thinking, just thinking back on Hegel. Of course, what you said is absolutely correct. Um, his relationship to the state, and his relationship to politics, well, his thinking on politics, his relationship to the state. Does that, I mean, did from my understanding, please correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not a Hegel expert. Um, did he have a more amicable relationship with the state or view of the state?
Absolutely. His philosophy of right, which is his key book about politics,
Right.
what forms one part of a colossal philosophical system, right? Hegelianism is, again, sort of the last systematic philosophy where I need to explain everything in order to explain anything. But
Right.
the moment of his system is politics and the modern state. And he definitely thinks the modern state is the actualization of freedom. It's the way that freedom gets realized in the world is through the institutions of the modern state. And so he has a kind of elaborate description of what the state is and how it operates. I think it's important to understand that the concept of freedom he's working with, there's not freedom in the sense of independence. There's freedom in the sense of capacity to act. So the state gives me the capacity to be political, to be public, to do things in the world. I'm not free when I'm alone in my room making decisions about what I watch on television. I'm free when I stand up in front of my equals and speak my mind and have an opinion. So this idea of public freedom
Mhm.
made possible by the state. Hegel definitely believes that the state is the actualization of reason in the world. What is real is rational. What is rational is real. But I mean, that can be read as deeply conservative. Therefore, whatever the state chooses, I have to accept it. Or it can be read as deeply radical. Therefore, every citizen participates directly in the governance of, in their own governance, in their own self-governance. So this kind of Republican idea that to be a citizen is to participate in the creation of the laws. And the young Hegelians read it the second way. They said that what he was saying was we need to be revolutionaries. They worship the French Revolution, right? That's their ideal. The
Right.
Japanese, Robespierre is their hero, right?
Okay. Okay.
And so they see this idea that the state is the actualization of reason. Therefore, according to Bruno Bauer, what the state must do is consume the churches. The state must take over the space that the churches currently possess. They possess this kind of autonomous authority. And Bauer says, but those spiritual forces can't be outside of the state. They need to be internal to the state. And so the goal is take control of the state, use it to crush the church, and take that, not to get rid of spirituality, but to make that spirituality part of our human life, to absorb it into human life. Is that kind of clear? So there's a kind of real institutional idea here that we need to get our hands on the state so we can use it to get rid of these ancient institutions called the churches, which fracture us and divide us and make us fall into sects and all of the different sects of Protestantism, but not to mention Protestants versus Catholics versus Jews in the state at the time. All of that's got to be wiped away so that everybody can get their focus on the ideal, which is universal citizenship. You need to be a citizen, not a Lutheran. You need to be a Prussian, not a Calvinist. And
Okay.
so that's the agenda. At first, that's the agenda. We can take control of the state and use it to humanize the religion.
So this is Bauer's agenda.
Yep.
Okay.
Well, it's a little complicated because he begins by being perceived as conservative
Right.
alien, and he kind of lays his cards. It's unclear where his real commitments are.
Hmm.
He's playing a shell game, or whether he changes his mind. He has an inspiration. Some people think it's Marx who actually convinces him to be an atheist, but
Okay.
it looks like somewhere in the late 1830s, early 1840s, he becomes an atheist, which means um, what I've just said, that
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
use the state to crush the churches.
Right. I mean, because um, again, my sort of very basic knowledge here was not the Prussian head of state interested in a unification.
That's right. So the from the late, well, in response to the French Revolution, the Prussian state has to modernize, and this is the so-called Reform era. After Napoleon defeats the Prussians, humiliating defeat of the Prussian army, realize that the reason for this is because they have all these ancient institutions. The army, in particular, is controlled by aristocrats who don't know how to fight, and you can't pit that against a people's army, which is what Napoleon had. So the Germans have to create a state that's capable of matching the great achievements of the French Revolution, which were achieved violently, right?
Mm.
But the Prussian state's going to try to do this institutionally and without violence.
Mm.
Definitely, Bruno Bauer is on the side of that. And one key policy there is we need to have one state church. We can't have all of these different sects, especially Calvinists and Lutherans. Lutheranism is also a million different sects inside of that. I don't know if you know anything about Protestants, but they're basically just always disagreeing. They protest. And so the idea is for the purposes of state centralization, right, which is what the achievement of the French Revolution was, we centralized power in the state. Well, for that purpose, we need to have one state church. And Bauer is in favor of this. All of the Hegelians are in favor of this. The people who are against it are the people like the Schleiermachians, the ones who say church life is unique, it's discrete, it's autonomous. Old ladies on benches, that's what the church is about. But for people like Hegel and Bruno Bauer, the church is a powerful institution of the state. It needs to be centralized. We take control of it. We make it rational. And we have a single liturgy, a single prayer book. This is hugely controversial. In fact, there's an immigration pattern in Australia of the so-called old Lutherans who fled this what they perceived as persecution. So they were conservative Lutherans who did not want to be united with the Calvinists, like they wanted to go to war with them. They wanted to get their pitchforks out and march over the hill and stab the people in the next neighborhood. So yeah, there's a lot of, and the Prussian king Frederick Wilhelm III was trying to accomplish this, and there's a lot of interesting stuff in the notes, like in the archive about you can't force a person into prayer at the end of a bayonet. Like he used military force to try to unify the churches against the will of a lot of conservative sects, and Hegel and Bauer are fully in favor of this.
All right. Okay.
And they perceive it as revolutionary. I think that's another key. I'm going to talk too much. I apologize.
No, that's fine.
The key thing is they're revolutionaries. But Marx colored the word revolution to mean anti-state. Like Marx got this idea that the state is the instrument of the ruling class, and that ultimately we have to let it wither away. That it really is just a tool in the hands of power. It's not the actualization of reason in the world as Hegel taught. It is just a weapon that powerful people use. The law too, like these are just weapons that powerful people use. Marx comes to that conclusion at the end of the 1840s, after he's been a young Hegelian. But the young Hegelians think quite the opposite. The state is the revolution, right? The state is the tool that you can use to achieve revolutionary ends.
Right.
Centralize the churches, redistribute wealth, get rid of the aristocracy, all of these other forces that are pushing for autonomous corporate existence, like the church or the universities or the aristocracy, the estates. Those all need to be consumed by the state. And the state can rationalize society.
And so for the young Hegelians, forgive my ignorance, they're okay. So the state is the revolution. It's, I guess, more than just a tool. Is that fair to say? It is.
That's right. They think it is the actualization of reason in the world.
Deactualize it. And so what happens when you achieve that? For them, that's it. The state has been conquered. It unites everything. It is the essence, the manifestation of the revolution, the physical reality of it. And we all just exist in this kind of.
They're not utopians. I think I heard what you're getting at.
I was just about to say that word.
Utopian picture. What they want is republicanism. They want all citizens to be equal and for their equality to be expressed in their political engagement.
Right.
So they want all citizens politically engaged all the time.
Right.
So it's more like a council system. Like you would have endless town halls, through rational deliberation, determining the laws that govern us. Now, there's not going to be one set of laws that once we achieve it, that's it. There's always going to be emerging demands, right? There's going to be new debates, new forms of democracy, new forms of identity that need some kind of recognition, et cetera. But that's great. That's politics. Politics goes on forever. The key that what they want to achieve is full public participation in all aspects of public life. And they're deeply, deeply Republican. I think this is really the key idea that, it's an idea that it's so hard to skip back to past our sort of democratic fog. But they think freedom is public life. And if
Right.
you want to be free, you have to give up your personal private interests. Like, who cares what religion you are? Who cares what, everybody's got base economic security. Nobody fights over what you worship. What we're all going to do is orient ourselves towards the universal. We're going to commit ourselves to the public good, everyone.
Mhm.
And we're all going to, and you and I might differ as to what the public good is, and good. We'll go to full, we'll fight over it, and one of us will win, and but the state, but one thing we know for certain is everyone will commit themselves to fighting for what they think is the public good. So this idea of full mobilization, a state of full citizens, fully mobilized all the time, I
Right.
guess is utopian. But you realize what they're coming out the back of is the reform era, and especially the wars of liberation against Napoleon, where all young men learn how to fight for
Mm.
the first time.
Mm.
All young men go to war. And they look at that and they say, well, everyone has devoted themselves to the public good here, which is to get rid of Napoleon. And they think, how can you preserve that kind of enthusiasm, that kind of political passion,
Mm.
that kind of energy indefinitely and make it not just a tool of war, but part of the way the state is run? Um, Something like that with COVID, when the COVID happened, there's this
Mm.
sense that we all have to commit ourselves to the public good. It didn't last long, but for a little
Yeah.
while, everybody's in this. And I think that when a state like it mobilizes for war, there's a lot of ugly parts of this, by the way. There's militarism deeply embedded into this too. But when a state mobilizes for war against a justified enemy, we've been attacked by Napoleon, the sense of like pure public enthusiasm. And they say that's what the state should be.
Mhm.
I guess their ideal, I'm talking too much, but I guess their ideal is they imagine that that's what Athens was like. They imagine that that's what the
Yeah,
Greeks were.
I was going to, yeah,
They've got a fantasy of what ancient
yeah, yeah,
democracy looked like. Everybody's always in the agora. No, I
yeah,
disagree.
debating forever.
Yeah, just debating forever.
Everything, yeah. So essentially, without a head of state of any kind, is this true in their view?
Well, they recognize that um, I guess you wouldn't have any natural head of state.
Hmm.
Political politics requires order. There might be some mechanism for deciding who's going to be the executive, but they have the classic Republican understanding of the legislative versus the executive, which is to say, the legislative decides on what the law is. They legislate. The executive is merely there to execute,
Okay,
do what the legislature asks them to do. They
okay.
don't rule. They execute. They're just the tool that lets you get things done.
Because yeah, I mean that's the other thing I was going to say is that's how you kind of. I mean, it doesn't matter what you call it. You can gain power through whichever means you can, and then essentially you become the the head, the ruler, the commander.
There's a
That's a
vanguard.
good distinction. Yeah.
There's a vanguard. They could say, well, me and my group of 8 friends, we represent the will of the people.
Mm.
That we don't, what's the mechanism for deciding how that is the case? Well, we're aware of history's course, and therefore we're going to stand in and be the committee of public safety and make all
Mm.
of these hard decisions that are really ultimately about advancing the cause of the revolution. If you
Mm.
know anything about revolutionary politics, I mean, these sorts of things happen, and
Mm.
they're not mushy Democrats. They're not like, let's make sure everybody agrees.
Mm.
That's
Mhm.
not
Mm.
it. They think we have the science of history. We know what needs to be done, and we're the hard people willing to do it.
Mm. Oh, it sounds inspiring.
I don't
Uh-huh.
know. Well,
Um,
I guess all of that is just to say they're not utopians. They're serious politicians. They
yeah.
know politics involves um, decisiveness, violence, planning, order, organization.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so no mucking around. It's just
Talking about
yeah. It's life or death.
They're
It's
proto-Leninists. They know, they think like the Bolsheviks thought.
mhm. So you mentioned that Karl Marx didn't quite follow that idea, and what would make him distinct from the young Hegelians in that sense?
He catches wind of the importance of mass politics. The young Hegelians are kind of a little bit dismissive of what they will call the masses at some points. They think, what we need to do is rationalize society, and we do that from the superior perspective of science and critique, which we've read and understood Hegel, so we know where history's going.
Mhm.
with these old ladies and benches at church every day. They can be, oh, we can mow over them and get history going as fast as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Marx, first of all, because of the failure, first of all, they failed. They failed to take control of the state, and it boggles their mind. How is it possible that the state, which we worship as the actualization of reason, is actually going to destroy us? Like it blows their mind. How's that possible? Hegel's told us this is supposed to be the actualization of reason, and we're speaking reason to the state, and it's not listening. It's defending churches. It's defending all those old ladies and benches. And how's that possible? So they just can't figure it out, and their whole system kind of comes apart at the seams as the state's being used to crush them. And then they go to jail, they're thrown in prison, they've got to flee into exile, they all lose their jobs. They're destroyed. They are destroyed. The state wins. And that's why you don't know who Bruno Bauer was. He thought he was the next Luther. He honestly thought, I'm the next Martin Luther. This is the second Reformation that solves the first Reformation, which left us with a little bit of religion. We need to get rid of it completely, and I'm the one who's going to do it. Right. He genuinely believed that, like he was a megalomaniac.
Right. Yeah.
But it didn't work. And so then everything is about how the hell did this happen? And that's Marxist develops a theory of the state that's going to allow us to understand why the young Hegelians couldn't win. Well, it's because the state isn't the actualization of reason. The state is just a tool, a weapon in the hands of power. And whatever class is dominant in society will use the state to pursue its interests. No amount of protest inside of the state is going to change that. It is in the interests of the powerful. And that becomes the kind of Marxist theory of the state, right? I guess my only contribution to that is that we need to know where it came from. Because if you want to attack Marx, the thing you go after is his theory of state. You say, this is just naive and reductivist. States aren't like that. They're way more complicated than that, Karl. It's not just a weapon that powerful people use to crush you. Same with the law. It's way more complicated than that. And you just write it off. So you can focus on economics. Oh, that's state and political nonsense. That's ideology. I mean, you got to know something about it, but what's really going on is economics. That's what Marx will say.
Right.
So most people say one of the key errors in Marxism is he has a weak theory of the state.
Right.
Or an insufficient concept of the political. He doesn't realize that people are free in public life, that you're free when you go and participate in the state. That's your freedom.
Right.
So if the state is just this empty chimera, then what you're saying is people don't need to be free, right? Therefore you get totalitarianism. Classic attack on Marx.
Okay.
I disagree with it, but if I want to protect him, what I'm going to say is, but don't forget, he came by that position honestly. He first believed in the state as the actualization of reason. He was a young Hegelian first. And it was the failure of that project that led him to this, in some sense, reductivist picture of the state. Yes. You need to understand it gestates in this other place. And then you can see then you return to his later work and realize, but he was saying shorthand. That's not really what Marx's position. Like often he was spoken slogans, Basically it's like this, like I can't elaborate it forever, but essentially the state's just a tool. He doesn't mean that's the case. He's just giving you a shorthand so he can get at some other issue.
Of course, yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes perfect sense. I mean, since the way that you put it into context, and you can see that unfolding, at least I can see it unfolding in my mind's eye, were I to be Karl.
However, a footnote, an important one. I'm the only person who thinks this way.
Oh, really? Okay.
Like the standard understanding of Marx, my interpretation is completely off the wall, according to most established Marx scholars. I have a really idiosyncratic approach.
In what way? In what way? Can you explore that a little bit?
Sure. Well, the Engels is, so I would say Marxism as a political doctrine, Marxism as a doctrine or as a theory of society, it's really Engelsism. Engels invents it retroactively after Marx dies. He wants to curate Marx for a late 19th century reading public. Okay. He wants Marx to be convincing to people in the later part of the 19th century. So he kind of reconstructs this kind of scientistic, positivist Marx, who thinks that society consists of a collection of positive facts, and if we just get a proper science of it, then we can understand it and direct it rationally. But that's a very late 19th century way of thinking that would be completely foreign to young Marx, right? Young Marx was very deeply rooted in the, how can I say, the German university system, metaphysics, basically. Like his
Yeah.
language is about substance and forms
Yeah.
and this metaphysical language. He's not about like inquiry and investigation.
Mhm.
It's not. He doesn't use scientific language. And
No.
the third version, what I'm saying is the late Engels reinvents this picture of the young Marx.
Okay.
We curate him for his reading public in a book called Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy. And that's the first time that Engels publishes Marx's theses on Feuerbach. Marx is probably, anybody who knows anything about Marx, they know the point is to interpret, the point's not to interpret the world, the point is to change it or whatever, that 11th thesis on Feuerbach, right?
Mhm.
In fact, it's his epitaph. If you go to his grave, the 11th thesis on Feuerbach, everyone else has only interpreted the world, the point is to change it. That was a completely forgotten scribble in a random notebook for Marx. Like all of his life, just thought maybe just a few scribbles. Engels goes back after his death, finds these and finds
Right.
other documents and uses them to say, look, this is really who Marx is.
Uh-huh.
And that picture gets deeply, deeply embedded in the Marx literature, so much so that almost all Marx scholars just accept it as doctrine.
Mhm.
They will even go back to early texts and completely read through the evidence. They'll just invent connections to Feuerbach. This is what a lot of my research is on this. There's just invented connections between Marx and Feuerbach, completely fantasies.
Okay. And is there did you mention a key text that you've written that makes this argument?
Oh yeah, I've written a bunch, but there's one that came out recently in History of European Ideas called um, oh damn, it's a quotation. It'll come back to me. Oh, the intelligence of the people. The intelligence of the people.
Okay.
So I show that there's one manuscript. So this is a long story, but there's one manuscript called The Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Law, which we don't, everybody assumes it was written in 1843, but Marx tore the cover off of it, which is where we've written the date. And the Marx's editors in the 20th century deduced that it must have been written in the middle 1840s after he was a young Hegelian. I prove, or I believe I can prove that it was written earlier.
Okay.
Means it's a contribution to young Hegelian thought. It's not a
Yes.
break with young Hegelian thought. And so you
Okay.
get a much different picture of this. But everybody, for a bunch of different reasons, because of certain editors who were committed to this Engels interpretation, said he must be responding to Feuerbach here. Feuerbach's name's not mentioned once in the whole document, but
Mm.
everybody who reads it takes it for granted that this is Marx discovering Feuerbach, breaking with the young Hegelians, and becoming a materialist. It's not at all what's happening.
Right.
I argue that it's his way of, it's a theory of the state, and it's his contribution to young Hegelianism. But you see this over and over again in Marx scholarship. Just people have read Engels' late interpretation, accepted it as dogma, and then go back into the early works and look for evidence of it, even when there's none. They'll just invent it.
Mhm.
This happens to all thinkers, though. This is not
Yeah.
unique to Marx. It's part of how intellectual history works. I guess the
Yeah.
question is, what do you think there's a bottom here? Like this would be what Harold Bloom would call a strong misreading, right? That's what
Mm.
Engels sets down, the strong misreading that then dictates everything that follows. And the question is whether I'm claiming that no, there is a correct reading, which is
Mhm.
what I'm saying. And I'm not just offering another strong misreading. I know what he actually says.
Right. Okay. So,
Your position on that? Do you have a position on that one? Like that's the kind of postmodern baloney that I came up with in the 90s when I was a graduate student. We all had to say there is no truth. There's just misreadings all the way down.
all
Um,
right. No, no, I don't subscribe to that. So I do believe there is a correct way of reading, at least closer to the truth than others.
yeah,
So
I,
yeah.
if I was trained in the other one, I was trained so deeply inscribed in me was this late 90s, early 2000s, I guess the late waning days of so-called post-structuralism, postmodernism.
Right.
That was training. And so it's hard to shake off, man.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Um, yeah, I think I may have escaped that slightly. So and also because of my interest in sort of different things that we're always questioning foundations and paradigms of thought and things like that. So I'm totally with you on this. And just I was just going to ask you if you don't mind. Then you, you've you've said this. So let's maybe just for the record reiterate this. So the, more accurate reading of Marx is what your sort of
Well, I'm most
thinking.
interested in, I'm decreasingly interested in Marx and increasingly interested in the young Hegelians themselves.
Okay.
I think Marx was a genius and very, very important. Obviously, you can't understand 20th century unless you understand something about Marx.
Hmm.
But I do think that he sat amidst a group of people who were equally brilliant, but
Hmm.
he was forgotten from history. There's an idea in Marx's dissertation. This is a long way to get it to your answer. But Marx wrote his dissertation on the Hellenists, what we call the Hellenist philosophers, so the post-Aristotelian philosophers, the Epicureans and the Stoics and the skeptics and so forth. And they're typically understood to be a sort of late reverberation, like the great philosophy is Plato and Aristotle. And then what they do is they make it practical and they make it into kind of therapy for individuals. Like, oh, you want to have a happy life, then you should do these things. And whereas Plato and Aristotle are ontological, metaphysical, great statements. But Marx, and he writes his dissertation on them, he says, but you can't understand a movement of thought if you ignore where it dies. Like death is internal to any movement. It's a
Mm.
profound idea, like death is internal to life. And you don't understand something unless you look at its valleys as well as its peaks, I guess is what he's saying. Like when these transition stages, these things that seem to be late reverberations, they seem to be degrading or something like that from one perspective. But if you give them their own credibility, then they're actually equal in height to what we take to be the pinnacles. Do you see what I'm saying? So like he's saying, you don't really understand a movement of thought in history unless you see where unless you take its death seriously.
Mm.
I feel like that's the same with me and the young Hegelians. Like they don't mean anything today, but you don't understand anything about the 19th century unless you look at those things that it left behind.
Hmm.
Like what gets left behind is internal to what remains. Is that kind of clear? Like it's a weird
Mm. Mm.
thing.
I'm really liking this. Yeah.
So you look at the minor, this is, I guess, my post-structuralist training. You look at the minor key, you look at the minor figures, and you see something
Hmm.
shaped there. And in another sense, it's also a kind of personal fantasy about scholarship. Like, I want to be interested in something that nobody else knows anything about. Grew up this working class kid, and the picture of the scholar as this kind of lost in some kind of completely esoteric world. I just love that, and I want to be that. Like it's a desire. Um,
Nice.
and so they're completely esoteric, they're completely unimportant, and that's what makes them all the more attractive to me.
Okay.
But there's something of their picture of politics, I think, it tells us something about political life that we miss a
Mm.
lot. This understanding of republicanism, I really am attracted to it.
Mhm.
There's a contemporary theory of republicanism, especially around Philip Pettit and to a lesser extent Quentin Skinner, these contemporary political and historical thinkers who want republicanism to be mostly about a theory of freedom, mostly about this idea of non-domination as opposed to non-interference. It doesn't matter if we don't know what that is. It's just a
Mhm.
contemporary political conception of republicanism. But it's really anodyne and watered down. I mean, real republicanism is the Jacobins, and real republicanism is militaristically fighting for freedom, and this real grappling with the relationship between violence and politics, and a real effort to understand it, not just like let's create a political order where everybody kind of gets along. This kind of risk management conception of politics. And so I find it it's real. There's some truth. There's some truth of politics in that a kind of democratic, pluralist model just pretends isn't there.
Mhm.
And they don't pretend it's not there.
Mhm.
They embrace it
Mhm.
in ways that are terrifying too. And look, I would not mince words. These people are the predecessors of the Bolsheviks. That's who they are. They're saying we have the science of society. We will be the vanguard. We will crush everyone in our wake. And we know where this is headed, and we are going to push society towards its inevitable conclusion. And they were criticized at the time in the newspapers at the time. These crazy young Hegelians, they think that they can guide society according to reason alone, and they don't give a crap about individuals' personal freedom or personal beliefs. People love religion. Why are you trying to crush it? They want to go to church on Sunday. Just screw them. They need to go to school and learn Hegel. But I find that you can't understand politics for real, I don't think, unless you grapple with those really hard things. And then finally, the thing is this connection to theology. I'm in agreement with the political theologians. I think most of our political language is secularized theological language. We still speak the language of theology and
Mm.
politics. Schmidt, I'm kind of in agreement with this idea, or at least these two are not as separable as we think.
Mm.
And most humans on planet Earth for all of human history have believed. Like the anomaly is this bunch of weird dudes on a little stick of land off the end of Western Asia for a couple hundred years, thought maybe you could do without a God in their universities. That's where they thought it. And even now we're realizing the tide's flowing back on that one. People believe, they have faith. And even those of us who believe we're secular also have a kind of faith. There's faith is something that's internal. Again, it's internal to non-faith. You can't have one without the other. So if you don't believe, you already believe on some level.
Yeah.
And so you can't, I just think that it's a mistake to try to understand human society without taking that very, very seriously.
Mm.
Faith. And so that's why the political theology stuff, that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to take it very seriously. They're not just saying we need to crush it. What they're saying is we need to humanize it.
Yep.
In fact, I'll go on and on, but
That's all right.
the young Hegelians loved the philosophes and the French Enlightenment, but they also thought they were too sterile.
Uh-huh.
The French atheists in the 18th century, they thought you could just tell people there is no God and everyone go, oh yeah. The young Hegelians realized you have to work through theology in order to come out the other end. And that's why you write books on the Gospels, showing in intense detail, these must have been written by individuals 100 years after, if there was a Christ, 100 years after he died.
Mm.
Must have been written for a political purpose. They must have been trying to accomplish something inside the Roman state. And that's what Bauer argues. You know, these are not funny stories about a really kind guy who gave everybody fishes. These are documents designed to organize human society
Right.
in particular ways. And they were deliberately built to be used as blueprints for a society of, they will say, I mean, they're pre-Nietzschean too, that they'll say what they are is they're a society of slaves, right? You have a society of people who are being liberated from their militaristic Roman overlords, and they need a language for expressing their experience. Well, give them the language of suffering, give them the language of heaven, give them the language of suffer through this life and come out the other end. You know, and that's Bauer's idea, is that this was political theology. And so that's why they really hated him, because he didn't give Christians anywhere to go.
Mm.
Christians would always say, even if the Gospels are completely false, they're ethical stories about how you live your life. They are the truth of human ethics, right? Even if you can say you can be a completely liberal theologian or Schleiermachian, it's all made up, I get it, but it's the truth of it is its ethical resonance or something like that. And Bauer's saying, no, F that, it's all political theology. It's all a way of controlling people.
Right.
No nice stories about a nice young guy who went around saying everybody should feel good about themselves. That's not what the Gospels are. And so they really hated him for that. And they
So it
also
has a political end. This
everything's politics.
Yeah.
Everything's politics all the way down. And
politics is the ultimate metaphysics.
correct. Yeah. And metaphysics is just another way of saying politics. I mean, politics in the widest possible sense, in the sense of how are humans going to organize our relationships with one another.
Yeah.
And so there is no metaphysics. I mean, that's like,
Okay.
in a world where everybody believes, you don't have an opposition between the metaphysical and the physical. Like, it doesn't exist. There's no transcendent and immanent. There's just the thing.
Mm-hmm.
I was always among students, like, when you walk on an airplane, do you wonder, how does this thing fly? You know what I mean? Like, you're just sitting there wondering, how can it possibly be a hunk of steel and metal is going to get off at 10,000 feet over the ocean? I'm just going to arrive in Vancouver in 12 hours. If you really thought about that, you would never get anything done in our society, right? You just have faith. Somebody knows how it works. We live a life of faith.
Mm-hmm.
So this is what it was like in the past vis-a-vis religion. Of course, the world is ordered according to God's will. How could it be otherwise? Of course, I'm going to get on a hunk of metal and fly over the ocean. Of course, because you have faith. And so that's the experience of faith. Again, I repeat myself, but I just don't think you can really understand human interaction unless you take that as seriously as the young Hegelians did.
Mm.
Yeah, you know.
Well, that sounds quite serious. And so I think just coming back to, I mean, we kind of really talked a lot more around Bauer than about Bauer specifically, but I think we've covered essentially what Bauer is about. So, in a sense, his argument is the political ends for theology, for religion, for state, and that sort of the true state. I think this was a something you sort of put in quotation marks. The true state is the one which is ultimately the vision of the young Hegelians. Is that right?
Yeah, the true state as the space of freedom for all citizens.
Mm.
And citizen doesn't necessarily mean all people, to be clear.
Mhm.
So it's someone who has realized that their private interests don't matter.
Mhm.
What matters is their commitment to the public good. You know, Coriolanus, Shakespeare's play Coriolanus, it doesn't matter, but there's a very famous Republican play in Shakespeare with Coriolanus, and there's no soliloquies,
All
there's
right.
nothing, there's no private life, there's no domestic life. The guy just lives for the state, and he's a soldier. This is their picture. They all want to be Coriolanus. I live
Okay.
a
Okay.
public life. I don't have private interests. I am only publicly oriented. But I guess before we finish with Bauer, though, his key concept is the self-consciousness, right? He's a Hegelian. He thinks the purpose of history is what he calls self-consciousness.
Yeah.
Another translation for that might be something like subjective freedom,
Mhm.
but freedom in this sense of the right to participate in the creation of the laws that will govern me. So
Mhm.
he have autonomy in the Kantian sense to give myself the law. So I can have autonomy, I can be self-conscious, I can have subjective freedom only if there's a state that gives me the space to realize those things. I need parliaments, I need newspapers, I need schools, I need universities, and the state will create these institutions where I can live a public life. What do you and I do? You know, we go and talk in front of your students or something. You know, so the state is creating this space where citizens can realize their freedom in the sense of realize their rational contribution to social
Mm.
interaction. But yeah, the key concept is self-consciousness. He gets it from Hegel. Hegel says something, I'm not a good Hegelian, but Hegel says something like this: God does not exist independent of his creation. God realizes himself in creating humans. So a human self-consciousness is an alienated reflection of God's consciousness of himself, right? That's a kind of rough Hegelian picture. And so there's this dialectic between creator and creation. And really what the Hegelians say, well, then in that case, why can't you just flip it the other way around? God
Mm.
is human self-consciousness. We realize ourselves by projecting it into God, which is Feuerbach's argument. And Bauer's got a version of it that's a little bit more historically articulated. That's his criticism. Bauer's criticism of Feuerbach is you have an abstract conception of the human essence. You just think that humans have always been more or less the same. You've got this kind of philosophical anthropology. We have these basic desires and drives, and we project them onto God. Bauer says, no. Humans have not always been the same. There is no abstract human essence. History creates who we are. So we invent ourselves through our practices and through history. P.S. Precisely what Marx says. That's exactly what Marx says against Feuerbach. There's no static human essence. There's just the unfolding of humanity through history. And so it's always changing. Our needs are always changing. Our desires are always changing. And they are part of a protracted historical process that you need to understand in detail in order to know what humans are. You can't just posit a human essence. All people want love. All people, whatever, have a heart and a head. This is what Feuerbach says. They said, this is nonsense. There's no human. There's just history. And
Mm.
everything is radically historical. Everything we think we are is the effect of contingent historical events. And Bauer gives this idea to Marx, and Marx uses it to disagree with Feuerbach, but Bauer had used it earlier to disagree with Feuerbach. I just went into a pit there, by the way. To say simply, Bauer's basic concept is self-consciousness. He thinks that history is the process of humans becoming self-conscious, which is to say free, which is to say publicly free. Um, and the state is the tool that makes that possible. Until about 1843, 1844, when he loses his job, he
Mm.
writes the book about the Gospels, which basically say the Gospels were not accurate accounts of real events. They were written by individuals, and their purpose was to control society. Jesus never existed. He's an invention of some Roman scribe who's just cooking him up in order to create a new tool for telling people how to live their lives. You're not going to spend a lot of time in a German university if that's what you think in the 19th century. Your days are numbered. And his days were numbered. The state issued quite a long process, a legal process to get him dislodged. To be similar to now, like the universities had quite a bit of power. And to be a professor was to have quite a bit of freedom, academic freedom. And the German university wanted to preserve academic freedom, which they thought was the effect of Protestantism, right? So this was him. On the one hand, they wanted to get rid of him. On the other hand, they wanted to be good Protestants, so they can't just kick him out. They've got to have a process where they inquire, long inquisition. All the theology departments in Germany have a big debate about whether this guy's an atheist, and if he is, whether he can teach in a university. All through the newspapers, he's the cause célèbre. All the liberals are defending him, but they get him out. He gets canned. He loses his license to teach, and that's in 1842. I think, don't quote me. It's 1842 or 43 that they finally dislodge him, and all of the young Hegelians scram. Mm-hmm. His brother, Bruno Bauer's brother, Edgar, who I've also written about, winds up in jail for many, many years. He's sentenced to prison for like 9 years. He only gets out because of the 1848 revolution. So there's an amnesty for all political prisoners.
Okay.
Marx and Arnold Rüg flee. They move to Paris. They're going to get arrested if they stay in Germany any longer. Bruno Bauer never gets arrested, but I think that's partly because he had a PhD and it was kind of ugly. The state didn't want to overreach. Mm-hmm. Some people were protected because of their cultural significance. Mm-hmm. But all the young Hegelians just scatter after that. And some of them become communists, some of them continue to be Republicans, some of them just give up on politics altogether. A lot of them become conservatives in a very short period of time. Mm-hmm. But Bruno Bauer has a huge influence on Nietzsche. Nietzsche met him and read him, and a lot of Nietzsche's kind of anti-Christian, anti-morality ideas are reverberations of Bruno.
Yeah, missing piece in the puzzle there. I had no idea, but that makes sense that you mentioned that.
They were like that. They were celebrities like that. If you go back to the newspapers, they were in the newspapers every day, and people were terrified of them. Like they were like they were celebrities, and they were considered really dangerous. Like Marx and Engels wrote these critiques of the young Hegelians, where they say stuff like, "They are just theologians. They are not interested in real politics. They don't know how to do mass politics." And it's not fair. They were just trying to get rid of them because Marx in particular was really good at this. He could dismiss people in a phrase. Like that was his thing. He was really good at saying, that guy's an idiot. Don't even listen to him. And in 2 sentences, an entire body of work, forget about Arnold Rüg. He's just an old doddering fool. He hasn't read Hegel. Marx was good at that. Polemicist, just taking out his enemies. And so he did that there's a book called The Holy Family, which is about Bruno Bauer and his brothers, and Marx and Engels just eviscerate them. But they leave this impression that they were toothless, apolitical theologians. Not at all. They were dangerous people who were, I think, I repeat myself, but their best analogy is the Bolsheviks. They were like the Bolsheviks. They thought they were the vanguard party. We seize control of the state. How do you get control of the state? Well, you're going to have to first get control of all these discourses, theology, politics, economics. You need to get control of them in the university first. The university is a real institution. If I can get control of theology departments and I can make them atheists, then I'm changing the way we worship, and people in their churches are going to be different. And then you've got a kind of real revolutionary force that could potentially mount an assault on the state and take control of the state as well. You know what I mean? Like that's the way they're thinking.
Wow. Yeah, dangerous.
Newspapers are full of those people saying these guys are really dangerous. There's a great conservative guy named Hengstenberg who goes after him. He says something like this. Let me see if I can remember. These are dangerous Jacobins. They're going to leave the Germany devastated, much worse than France was devastated, right? So the devastation that they're going to bring on Germany was going to way superior to the devastation that we saw in France. And if they have their way, he says something like, they'll demolish all churches, they'll smash down the steeples, they'll take the bells and melt them down and turn them into cannons. So they'll take the church bells, melt them and turn them into cannons. And what they mean is they are Napoleonic revolutionary expansionists. They are going to take the energy of the church and organize people to a military assault on all of Europe in order to spread the Republican Revolution, right? So and that's what they wanted. Hengstenberg was right. um, and that's the energy that's behind the 1848 revolutions too. That's
Okay.
all that 1848 is prepared for by this way of thinking.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Um, Brilliant. I think that kind of exhausts the questions I had.
I don't want to keep.
We came to them in a nice way, and we covered them um, very well, I think. So I'm quite satisfied given my limited knowledge. So I'm hoping that this podcast will be useful and interesting to those listening as well. Take away something very exciting here. So I want to thank you for your time, Charles. I really appreciate it. I know you're very busy. It's a crazy time right now, and I appreciate you taking out the time to talk to me.
Absolutely, Milad. It's a real pleasure, and I'm so glad that you're interested in my weird little corner of
Not at
intellectual.
all.
And if anybody who's listening wants to chat about any of that, they can email me. I'm perfectly accessible online. Um, but yeah, I really appreciate the chance to have
Sounds great. Sounds great. I really appreciate it.
it.
Um, Thank you.